All right. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Duggett, so I'm the organizer of this event. So welcome to this digital event in a new series of events from the Friends of Coleridge. It's great to see everyone here today. I'm going to hand over now to Tim Fulford, who I think all of you know, who's going to introduce us to today's speaker, Dr. Joanna Taylor. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. This is the one in a series of talks that we have had and will be having from the Friends of Coleridge, celebrating Coleridge's 250th anniversary in proper Coleridgean fashion. We're a year late. Jo Taylor, as many of you know, is one of the organisers of the Coleridge Conference.
One more action.
She is the author of several articles about Coleridge and also about Hartley Coleridge. Not least, she is the author of an article in here, the new Coleridge Companion, Cambridge Companion to Coleridge. I'll put some links to that in the chat for those of you who are interested in this collection of essays. And Jo is a lecturer in 19th century literature and in digital humanities at the University of Manchester. And she's also the author of Deep Mapping, a digital humanities approach to understanding the literary Lake District, a book which she co-wrote with Ian Gregory and came out last year with Bucknell University Press. She tells me that the sequel to Deep Mapping the Literary Lake District is going to be Sheep Mapping the Literary Lake District. And although she may not be talking about sheep today, she is talking about nature, about ecology. Jo.
It's good of you to get your own joke into that introduction.
I did at least credit you.
I thought it was a good sheep call. So thank you to Tom and Tim for asking me to talk and for organising everything. And thanks to everybody for coming on this pretty grim here, at least Friday afternoon. This is my first talk post-baby, so I think I can remember vaguely how to form sentences, but forgive me if I lose myself halfway through one. And to those of you who've already read the Cambridge Companion that Tim mentioned, please forgive me the repetition. This is a revised version of that chapter. So here as there, I've tried to channel what Jeremy Davis and Anna Hithnesessian and others think is a mission of central importance to eco-criticism, so that is close reading. I've included a fair few quite long passages from Coleridge's works, and I can add a handout in the chat once I finish talking, so we'll all have those quotations for the discussion at the end, and I will, in fact, share my screen. Let's do that now. There we go. So hopefully you can all see those slides, but just wave at me in the chat if you can't see them. So I hope that those two things will help us to dive deeper into some of those passages and into Coleridge's works in our post-talk discussion, which will be in about 45 minutes. So picture the scene. It's 20 to 4 one morning in 1803, and Coleridge is awake after a sweat-soaked night of bad dreams induced by opium withdrawal. Being Coleridge, naturally, he found this the ideal moment to philosophize. In this instance, he identified a central tenet of what would grow into the science of ecology, the recognition of nature as an infinite series of connections between individual examples of all types of matter. Anticipating the terminology of ecological science by a good century and a half, he described a world as, I think I have this one, there you go, a world as an harmonious system where an infinity of kinds subsist each in a multitude of individuals, apportionate to its kind in conformity to laws existing in the divine nature, and therefore in the nature of things. This thought marked one of what James McCusick calls the logical developments from Coleridge's early views on the interrelatedness of the natural world. That, as McCusick thinks, inspired Coleridge's mature views on aesthetic organicism. So rather than seeing all life as one, as he had in around 1795 to 96, Now Coleridge was beginning to consider questions that would come to underpin his ecopoetics and eco-philosophies for the rest of his career. That is, how can a world made up of disconnected things also function as an integrated whole? And perhaps more seriously, what if there actually was no connection, no communication between human and non-human beings? Exploring these questions then requires a view of Coleridge's career that shifts away from the one more usually found in romantic eco-criticism. That tradition has tended to focus on the poems that were the results of Coleridge's close collaboration with William Wordsworth, and often identify the Dejection Ode as the moment when Coleridge articulates the collapse of his eco-poetics, just as that creative relationship with Wordsworth was starting to break down. But what I want to argue is that if we read the Dejection Ode as a catalyst for a Coleridgean eco-poetics that the poet was to spend the remaining 32 years of his career developing, we find an underexplored avenue in Coleridge's thinking. In this approach, we might situate Coleridge's dejection not as a failure in a dominant Wordsworthian ecology, but rather as a starting point for an alternative model of romantic eco-poetics. Coleridge's approach, I think, is really distinctive in a tradition where what the eco-critic Hubert Zapf calls a conspicuous aspect has been a tendency to emphasize relationality and interconnectedness on all levels, a kind of global happy families going on all the time, particularly in the works of people like Wordsworth. Yeah, oh, thanks, Tom. Tom's put the handout in as a link in the chat, so you'll be able to see the main Coleridge quotations that I'm talking about as I go through. So those qualities, though, relationality and interconnectedness that Zapf identifies in eco-criticism and eco-literature, those aren't really what it tends to feel like living in the world, I don't think, either now or in the Romantic era. Something that I worry we often risk forgetting in the way that we talk about Romanticism is that disconnection from the non-human world was as much a characteristic of the Romantic period as connection with it. So in a period of mass enclosures and widespread urbanization, we might just as easily see the Romantic period as the starting point for the widespread apathy towards the non-human world that's defined everyday responses to non-human actors in the 20th and 21st centuries. Alongside Coleridge's Mariner, about which more shortly, Keats's Belle Dame sans Merci might be the era's archetype for that new disconnection. When the night kisses her wild, wild eyes shut and he lands in her thrall, plants wither and birds fall silent. Both poems hypothesize about when a union between human and non-human turns nightmarish, and both of them act as warnings for connecting too much with natural things. A challenge for modern ecology is to work out how to connect people who are culturally severed from nature with the non-human world. In Coleridge's terms, it's a question of what tools to use to extend human consciousnesses towards conversation with non-human things. So if we see Coleridge's disconnection from the non-human world as an early and individual symptom of a modern social problem, then we can also find in his writing guidance for how to utilize, if not to overcome, that problem. Coleridge's most important interventions in romantic eco-poetics ask, when it comes down to it, I think, one simple but kind of devastating question. What happens to the person or the thing that is shut out from that ecosystemic communication chain? So the major sort of recalibration of Coleridge's ecological thought started to happen in around 1802 to 1803, when I think he just became much more pessimistic about the state of the world and himself in it. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that it co-occurs with another significant moment in Coleridge's poetic life, that recognition that there was what he called somewhere or other a radical difference between his thoughts on poetry and Wordsworth's. One of the key differences that he identified was the increasingly clear disjunction between the two poets' understandings of nature. So at the same time that Coleridge was developing his nascent understanding of the world as a system of intramaterial relations, It seemed to Coleridge that Wordsworth was elevating nature into a deity, and that made Coleridge super uncomfortable. In October 1803, after what sounds like horrendous afternoon of confrontations between the Williams, Hazlitt and Wordsworth, not an afternoon anyone wants, Coleridge wrote or addressed Wordsworth in his notebook. He asked, "Would the bishops Ray or Durham have spoken of God as you spoke of nature?" Wordsworth's apparent deification of an abstraction really worried Coleridge, but in Wordsworth's view, nature, as we know, was pretty godly. It was the spirit that rolled through all things. In Wordsworth's personal histories, this is from the Prelude, the beauteous forms of nature were collaterally attached to his memories. Nature was always Wordsworth's most important collaborator, and no solitary in Wordsworth's corpus need be lonely if he or she was in tune with the non-human world. Coleridge's works are a little different. His early poetic records of witnessing what he called in 1795 one life within us and abroad expressed a similar sense of cohesion, and those early ecopoetics share with Wordsworth what James McCusick has called a holistic concept of the earth as a household that clearly foreshadows the modern science of ecology. But there was a consistent difference between the two poets' ecologies. As Edward Kessler recognised as early as 1979, even in Coleridge's youthful conversation poems, the delights of nature conceal a vacancy. It's that vacancy, I think, that I'm sort of trying to get at over the course of this paper. In Coleridge's writing, there's a perpetual sense of disconnection between himself and the things of the world. Coleridge himself thought the reasons for that difference could be located in the poet's biographies. While Wordsworth grew up among his native Lakeland mountains, Coleridge had been sent, or transplanted, as he put it in a poem addressed to his brother George, away to school in London at 9 years old. As he explained to George in that poem, he was sent away ere his soul had fixed its first domestic loves, including to the non-human features of the local landscape. From that point, finding himself in the great city, pent, Coleridge felt isolated from lovely nature, except for the skies and stars that enveloped the school's cloisters. In Frost at Midnight, that confinement leads to a burst of creative energy that's embedded in visions of the natural world. So from being himself pent up, he releases a vivid imagining of his son Hartley's future, wandering like a breeze by the lakes and beneath the mountains of the rural north of England. So he's kind of foreseeing for Hartley there the kind of Wordsworthian identification with nature that he was unable to find for himself. That said, though, Coleridge nevertheless also began exploring an ecopoetics based on a sense of severance from other life forms as early as 1797. An anxiety about the effects of sealing oneself off from the non-human world is at the heart of Coleridge's vision in a dream, Kubla Khan, in which Kubla encloses twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers. For a time, of course, the gardens overflow with life. Sinuous rills both make natural music and water the incense-bearing trees and the ancient forests. But the earth seems to fight back against this unnatural containment. From a deep romantic chasm bursts the mighty fountain that destroys Kubla Khan's pleasure dome, which becomes no more than a shadow floating away on the waves. The poem unwittingly documents more than just an imagined catastrophe. Recent investigations in the region controlled by the historic Kubla Khan have revealed that that empire was a serious early polluter through its intensive mining activities. Not that Coleridge would have known that, but I think it's intriguingly hits on it. In Coleridge's Ecopoetics, though, the concern is more imaginative. What might happen, the poem worries, if we act as though we are isolated and build over natural forces in ways that disregard the agency and the power of non-human things. Perhaps the more obvious instance of disconnection's consequences occurs in that parable of ecological transgression, the rhyme of the ancient mariner. In that poem, the eponymous mariner shoots a non-human bystander, an albatross, in what Jonathan Bate calls an inhospitable act of environmental violence. As Bate explains, it breaks the contract of mutual dependency, which binds species in a network of reciprocal relations. Afterwards, the mariner's disconnection from that network seems complete. We're told that he becomes alone, alone, all alone, alone on the wide, wide sea, and Christ would take no pity on my soul in agony. That stupefying stasis, both the ships being becalmed and the mariner's isolation, is enacted through the repetition of that one syllable, all lone, all lone, all lone, all lone on the wide, wide sea. That all, I think, both gestures towards ecological unity and emphasizes the mariner's utter disconnection from it. I wonder if there's something a little deceptive in that repetition. Repeating the word makes it, ironically, kind of companionable, and begins to indicate that the mariner may not be isolated as he seems, as he feels. In a really excellent 2020 article, Seamus Perry argues that through what looks like weakness, a being astray, a wandering, Coleridge arrives at something that a greater sense of purpose or intent would not have pulled off. It's in that state of complete disconnection from other life that the mariner notices that a million slimy things lived on, and so did I. At this stage, all the mariner shares with those creatures that he can only see as things is life itself, this kind of bare bones expression of existence. Yet that recognition of a shared life force holds open the possibility for redemption, because it acknowledges, even at a basic, a really fundamental level, a shared experience. He is saved and reinstated into the global ecosystem when he names those things as water snakes, thereby acknowledging their status as living beings. That act of naming and his blessing of them demonstrates a new awareness that all creatures, great and small, matter. The mariner's inexorable task becomes to tell his tale, repeating his trauma again and again, with the aim of leading other human beings disconnected from the non-human world towards reintegration with the global ecosystem. Like his Ancient Mariner, Coleridge was to find that he had to reach utter aloneness, and to do so repeatedly before he could recover a sense of connection with other living beings. By 1802, his inability to find oneness with the natural world seemed to encapsulate what Coleridge saw as his failure in what had been his and Wordsworth's joint poetic project. He, it seemed, couldn't see into the life of things. In this year, his mind became even more than usually abstracting. He wrote that he looked at mountains and saw only curves, and stars were reduced to triangles. In the terms that Coleridge would use in the Dejection Ode, he could see these elements of the non-human world, but not feel them. Josie Dixon identifies experiences like this as results of what she calls imbalances between the eye and the mind, a characteristic feature of those debilitating episodes of dejection that Coleridge was experiencing in the early 1800s. Coleridge's daughter Sarah, who also experienced similar symptoms of anxiety and depression, and who also experienced something not quite the same as, but at least in the same ballpark as the abstractions that Coleridge did. She explained that the tendency towards extreme abstraction was what she thought of as everything becoming too real. And she thought that it was a result of being too alive to outward impressions and too full of speculations suspecting them. For Coleridge himself, this profound awareness of a disjuncture between I and mind and things fueled his belief that he was now no poet in the face of Wordsworth's true poetry. But what Coleridge is writing in all of its various forms ends up doing, I think, is recording a lifelong fascination with exactly that gap, those gaps between I and mind and things, and between human and non-human beings. And it repeatedly asks what happens or what might fail to happen in that gap, in what ways might communications break down, become too abstracted? Material eco-criticism quite often uses phrases like the human and non-human meet halfway. But in Coleridge's works, the meeting places between those different kinds of agencies are rarely either so neat or so peaceful. Tim gets the credit for that point. That was one of his very helpful editorial interventions. So in Coleridge's understanding, human and non-human agencies were more like a spectrum than an opposition. He came to believe that, in his words, thinking of ourselves as separated beings and placing nature in antithesis to the mind, as object to subject, thing to thought, life to death, resulted in mere understanding that was disconnected from the lived experience of being in the world. Instead, Coleridge surmised that the organic and inorganic are necessary relative distinctions, and that the places where they came together, the moments at which those relations could be determined, that those places were more the point than artificial assessments of what kind of life mattered. In Coleridge's experience, the importance of those relations were never clearer than at the exact moments when he felt most isolated. December 1804 was a case in point. In the middle of his self-imposed exile to Malta, Coleridge was cogently summarizing his understanding of ecosystems as being representative of what he called the great game laws of nature, a careful balance between natural phenomena and human management. Fish with nets of such meshes as permit many to escape and preclude the taking of many seemed to him to encapsulate the principles of habitat sustainability. Two races are saved, he explained, the one by taking part and the other by part not being taken. So central to this example are the meshes that facilitate and control interactions and connections between individuals or even species. In this, Coleridge anticipates a metaphor that's been really fruitfully deployed by Timothy Morton, who's argued that thinking of ecological relationships as a mesh does away with boundaries between living and non-living forms, and indicates instead both the holes in a network and the threading between them. For both Coleridge and Morton, meshes are important because they support meeting points between different things. So like I've said, it's those meeting points that were really fundamental for Coleridge. While it's true that Coleridge continued throughout his career to describe what he called a rival conflict between the human mind and external nature, nevertheless, his ecological thinking became a really prime example of the group of philosophies under the heading extremes meet, an axiom that Coleridge thought really defined his work. The extremes themselves matter much less than the ways that they intersect. So the relationship between the self and the non-human world was Coleridge's most persistent example, I think. He discovered something which Morton has deftly summarized. So Morton writes that if you look for nature, all you'll find are trees, butterflies, oceans, primates. Nature sort of conceptually dies at the moment when we view the planet as an ecological mesh, because as Morton goes on, suddenly things that you think of as real, such as the fish in Coleridge's previous example, suddenly they become the abstraction. That shift worried Coleridge, as it would concern later poets as well. So Tennyson, for instance, finds in nature benevolence at the level of the species, but cruelty towards the abstracted individual. So this is from In Memoriam. He writes, "So careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life." Like Coleridge, Tennyson doesn't find any comfort in abstraction, either ecologically or personally, and both poets worry about the risk that everything might slip through the holes in the mesh. What's to stop the self from also being abstracted as one more individual entity in a disconnected universe? So abstraction famously did Coleridge absolutely no favours with the reading public. But nevertheless, that process of abstracting was completely central to his experiences, to the whole way that he conceived the world. His repeated explanation of his perceptions starting with a notebook entry from October 1803, make clear how enmeshment underpinned Coleridge's thinking. So this is another from 1803. He writes, "Nothing affects me much at the moment it happens. It either stupefies me, and I perhaps look at a merrymaker and dance the hay of flies, or listen entirely to the loud click of the great clock. Or I am simply indifferent, not without some sense of philosophic self-complacency. For a thing at the moment is but a thing of the moment. It must be taken up in the mind, diffuse itself through the whole multitude of shapes and thoughts, not one of which it leaves untinged, between which and it some new thought is not engendered. This is a work of time, but the body feels it quicken with me." There's a lot to love about this quotation, I think. The kind of vividness of the perceptions that he's describing, and also that articulation that every thought that's happening to him is not just happening as a kind of mental process, that the abstraction's almost physical as well. So that means, though, that the problem for Coleridge isn't kind of simply abstraction, but rather this disorientating experience of being, and this is Kessler again, he calls it continually suspended between thoughts and things, continually suspended. I think that's like a lovely metaphor for Coleridge's entire career, really. That process is not the same as Wordsworth's ability to fuse man and nature. The enmeshment that Coleridge is describing here rather creates a third space that sits between thought and thing and combines elements of both. In the Biographia Literaria, that meeting point, filtered through Schelling, becomes the SM plasticity that Coleridge sees as being that defining trait of the imagination. But by 1818, he could explain the process in more detail, and did so via a marginal gloss to the Friend. And this gloss was also repeated in a letter in November 1819, where he writes, "From my very childhood, I have been accustomed to abstract, and as it were, unrealize whatever of more than common interest my eyes dwelt on, and then by a sort of transfusion and transmission of my consciousness, to identify myself with the object." In the November 1819 letter, this explanation acts as a gloss to the poem Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix, which Coleridge had adapted from the German original by Frederica Brunn. Coleridge recalls Wordsworth's condemnation of the poem on the grounds that it was, what Wordsworth thought, a specimen of a sort of dreaminess which would not let Coleridge see things as they were. Instead, Wordsworth thought, Coleridge used his extraordinary powers to summon up an image or series of images in his own mind. No good. Wordsworth wasn't exactly wrong, but nor was he entirely right. What Coleridge actually did was, I think, more interesting. He unrealized objects and kind of dehumanized himself so that human and non-human perspectives intertwined somewhere in the middle. What Coleridge described is what Karen Barrett has called meeting the universe, in a space where matter and meaning become inextricably fused together, so that mattering, says Barrett, mattering is simultaneously a matter of substance and significance. So to put it another way, when extremes meet in Coleridge's intellectual habitat, they find a space for the human and non-human to hybridize. This wasn't a benign process in Coleridge's view. The principal risks were sort of twofold. Firstly, that this hybridization might be fragile, or secondly, and what was perhaps worse, that it might be so robust that it destroyed individual identity. In Coleridge's thinking, though, that hybridization was particularly important when dealing with non-human lives. As he explained in The Friend, abstractions are unhelpful if they mean that we think of ourselves as separated beings and place nature in antithesis to the mind as object to subject, thing to thought, life to death. But positioning the human in antithesis to the natural was, so he thought as well, to explore no more than the science of mere understanding. A poem or a notebook entry recorded an enmeshment that went beyond that limited science to document the byproduct of encounters between thoughts and things. In fact, writing it down might be the most secure part of those fragile meshes. In Coleridge's works, those meeting points are felt and acknowledged most explicitly when the extremes are at their most distant and the meetings the most delicate. So that is when Coleridge felt himself to be the most disconnected from other living things, both human and non-human. They were also the moments at which those meetings became both most perilous and most urgent. They could be dangerous because the poet was at his most vulnerable. And in these times of dejection and disconnection, Coleridge worried that the abstracting process might be both a defense, a defense against merging with other living things, which kind of inevitably in his experience brought pain, but also the means by which his very identity was displaced. We see this in November 1799 during his walking tour of the lakes with Wordsworth, during which Coleridge imagines being possessed by, he describes it as the ghost of a mountain, the form seizing my body as I passed and became realities, I a ghost till I had reconquered my substance. In early 1804, he's still wondering about working up something on the wanderings of this ghost through the world. That fear of being so profoundly enmeshed with an antagonistic ecosystem that his sense of self could be literally ejected from his body by a non-human life force was preoccupying Coleridge in the weeks leading up to the first publication of that poem, which, more than any other, I think, explored what might happen when the poet felt himself as a separated being, the Dejection Ode. So I want to spend the rest of our time really talking about the Dejection Ode, which is hands down my favourite Coleridge poem. And I felt during writing this entire chapter that I'd just waited far too long to indulge my love of it at such an extent, so forgive me. You've got all the passages that I'm going to talk about on the handouts, and I'll pop them on screen too. So in Karen Barrett's vision of an enmeshed universe constructed around the meeting points between living things, human beings are not outside observers of the world, but she writes, neither are we simply located at particular places in the world. Rather, we are part of the world in its ongoing intra-activity. Which I just think is lovely and is such an optimistic way of looking at the world, and it would be just thrilling to feel like we're all always just so part of our environment that we can feel, you know, the bird song and the trees growing, whatever, through our being, and that we're all part of this kind of lovely cohesive community. And maybe sometimes we can feel like that, but when that is not the case, is for someone experiencing really profound dejection or depression, as Coleridge was in 1802. At that moment, feeling alone in his failing marriage and increasingly isolated from his friends as his opium addiction became rather painfully clear, Coleridge found himself to be outside the rest of the world's intra-activity. And it's in that state that he drafts this most profound and I think certainly the most moving exploration of an ecopoetics founded not like Wordsworth's on interconnection with the world, but specifically on disconnection from it. So the morning after, a lot of you will know this story, but indulge me while I tell it anyway. The morning after hearing Wordsworth recite his draft of the Immortality Ode, when Wordsworth asks, whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it gone, the glory and the dream? The morning after, Coleridge had started to provide an explanation for this loss in himself. Annis de Selincourt thought the root idea of a letter to Dash and the great poem that emerged from it, the Dejection Ode, that these were Coleridge's developing realization of a contrast between himself and Wordsworth as lovers and writers. But I think that we can add here as ecologists too. Kessler notes that the Dejection Ode is the product of a strikingly Coleridgean method of poetic composition, whereby separate fragments and drafts and messes are all combined into one poem. So the poem itself is kind of a product of enmeshment. It becomes a meeting point for Coleridge's ongoing reflections about how his dejection and sense of disconnection affected his ecopoetics. So Coleridge started writing the Dejection Ode from his Keswick study as a storm blew across the mountains. And the ode registered the really profound mental anguish that was arising from Coleridge's feeling of complete estrangement from both social and natural ecosystems. So in Sibyllin Leaves, the poem reads, all this long eve, so balmy and serene, have I been gazing on the western sky, and its peculiar tint of yellow-green. And still I gaze, and with how blank an eye, and those thin clouds above in flakes and bars that give away their motion to the stars, those stars that glide behind them or between, now sparkling, now bedimmed, but always seen. Yon crescent moon, as fixed as if it grew in its own cloudless, starless lake of blue. I see them all so excellently fair. I see, not feel, how beautiful they are. Coleridge is not only mourning the loss of his own hopes for happiness here, nor just his sense of being not able to reach with Wordsworth into the life of things, but he's mourning a severing from his contemporaries' intellectual and aesthetic communities. His isolation is kind of self-imposed, protecting him from the disorientating and sometimes even traumatizing experiences that being close to an unfulfilled or unrequited connection can bring. But that doesn't make it any less painful. That inventory of the night sky's contents, structured by the repetition of that distancing those stars, for example. Sorry, I've lost myself in my excitement about reading the poem. So structured by those distancing, that kind of underscores the poet's disconnectedness from that one life that he can now only perceive abroad. He can't seem to position himself as part of the living things that he lists. The half rhyme in that final jarring couplet emphasizes his distinction, fair and are. It seems that in the process of describing his own relationship to the nocturnal ecosystem, Coleridge can't seem to really even maintain the couplets that bind together his descriptions of the night sky. That apparent dissonance between thought and things is even more pronounced in the earlier version of the poem. A letter to Dash was explicitly addressed first to Sarah Hutchinson, then to Wordsworth, the later versions redacted to protect the family's privacy. But the change also reduces that sense that part of Coleridge's sense of disconnection was specifically associated with his close friend and with the woman that he'd already spent 3 years obsessing over. Naming them offers the speaker really specific contrasts with his own isolated state. So this is the earlier version of the same stanza. All this long eve, so balmy and serene, have I been gazing on the western sky and its peculiar tint of yellow-green. And still I gaze, and with how blank an eye, and those thin clouds above in flakes and bars that give away their motion to the stars, those stars that glide behind them and between, now sparkling, now bedimmed, but always seen. Yon crescent moon as fixed as if it grew in its own cloudless, starless lake of blue. A boat becalmed, dear William's sky canoe. I see them all so excellently fair. I see, not feel, how beautiful they are. The verse itself here is a self-conscious contrast with the fast-moving sky canoe from the 1798 prologue to Wordsworth's Peter Bell. In that poem, the living boat gives the poet access to terrestrial and extraterrestrial communities, even if the boat does scold him for wanting to make it no better than a boat twin sister of the crescent moon. In Coleridge's hands, though, the canoe is a symbol of disconnection, unable to interact with that starless lake of blue. It can only hang isolated from the other elements of the night sky in a mariner-like becalmed state. Like the mariner, too, Coleridge is alone, all alone, cut out from what he perceives as an otherwise pretty universal mesh. In the mariner's case, that exclusion is the result of an unwitting misjudgment about the agentic powers of non-human lives that calling the water snakes things, as we saw earlier. But in Coleridge's case, it's a knowing acknowledgement of those same agencies. But Coleridge does imply a kind of glimmer of hope in his observations on the stars. At first glance, he imparts his own sense of isolation onto them. They glide behind the clouds, giving nothing in return for the motion given to them. But another possibility occurs here. Perhaps they don't remain behind, but come between. In Peter Bell, Wordsworth goes with his boat between the stars to pry among the constellations. And Coleridge holds open the chance here that the stars might still be meeting points for the poet who can feel them. The poem concludes by seeming to find options for these meeting points. One passage in particular, which was removed from published versions of Dejection until 1817, but was circulated in the meantime in letters to friends, it really anticipates the possibility of finding new connections. So the poem blames Coleridge's abstruse research for his failure to write poetry, of course, although, as Morton D. Paley observes, the ode is itself a refutation of such an argument. Yet that research explicated the kind of abstracting process, which allowed Coleridge virtually to communicate with human and non-human beings, even in his isolation. We've seen that through all of those notebook entries where he's trying to work out this relationship between human, non-human, and an abstraction as some kind of meeting point. So even in his isolation, he's still trying to work out where those meeting points lie. The next stanza, I think, shows that kind of vicarious building of connections in progress. It's quite long, but I think it's lovely. So we'll read the whole thing. So this is towards the end of the Dejection ode, the Sibyllin Leaves version. He writes, "Hence viper thoughts that coil around my mind, reality's dark dream. I turn from you and listen to the wind, which long has raved unnoticed. What a scream of agony by torture lengthened out, that lute sent forth. Thou wind that ravest without, bare crag or mountain tarn or blasted tree, or pine grove whither woodman never clomb, or lonely house long held the witch's home. Methinks were fitter instruments for thee, mad lutanist, who in this month of showers of dark brown gardens and of peeping flowers makes devil's yule with worse than wintry song. The blossoms, buds, and timorous leaves among, thou actor perfect in all tragic sounds, thou mighty poet e'en to frenzy bold, what tell'st thou now about? 'Tis of the rushing of a host in rout, with groans of trampled men, with smarting wounds. At once they groan with pain and shudder with the cold. But hush, there is a pause of deepest silence. And all that noise is of a rushing crowd, with groans and tremulous shudderings. All is over. It tells another tale, with sounds less deep and loud, a tale of less affright, and tempered with delight, as Otway's self had framed the tender lay. 'Tis of a little child, upon a lonesome wild, not far from home, but she hath lost her way, and now moans low in bitter grief and fear, and now screams loud and hopes to make her mother hear. So it's the wind here that links disconnected things, the bare crag, the remote tarn, the blasted tree, the unvisited grove, the lonely house, the lost child, and the dejected poet. The wind sort of comes into the study and beckons him outside. Together they form a collective of all isolated, but yet interconnected things. What unites them, as well as the wind's tragic sounds, is their shared disconnection. The last stanza of the poem hopes for the lady to find herself enmeshed in the intra-actions of all things. The poem says, "To her may all things live from pole to pole, their life the eddying of her living soul." But actually, the poem demonstrates the poet's own ability to use disconnection to recover a sense of involvement in that same ecosystem. It is, after all, the Coleridgean speaker who is able to interpret the wind's stories. By the poem's end, even if he can't see or feel, the speaker is at least able to hear the enmeshment of human with non-human life. This, I think, is the sum of Coleridge's Ecopoetics, that what starts in dejection, in disconnection, can and kind of must transform into self-reflexive connection with and between human and non-human ecosystems. That connection in itself brings dangers. It runs a very real risk that the self might be remade in other molds, a kind of aggressive takeover of individual agency by an ecosystemic collective. Poetry, which by its kind of nature enmeshes the world experienced with one imagined, provides the site at which those kinds of evaluations can take place. Wordsworth's might, as Coleridge certainly believed, be the ideal ecopoetics, as he wrote in his Theory of Life. It's a model where the poet's genius and originality are in sympathy and intercommunion with nature. But Coleridge's ecopoetics offer an alternative vision that, while darker and a little bit more depressing, is no less valuable, I don't think. The theologian John Milbank has written that while Coleridge doesn't anticipate our contemporary concerns, he does stand alongside us on the margins of still unresolved problems. Climate change and Coleridge's sense of disconnection, his dejection, is, I think, a case in point. It has a really important role to play in modern ecology at a moment when humans, at least in Western civilizations, are increasingly disconnected from our non-human counterparts. Jonathan Bate wonders what might be the legacy of Romantic poetry in the 21st century, and he answers that Romantic poetry can enable us to think fragility. Coleridge's fragility is more obvious than most, but it also offers hope. In Coleridge's Ecopoetics, dejection becomes the impetus needed to inspire ecological care. At a moment of environmental catastrophe and climate crisis, driven to a substantial degree by widespread apathy towards, or we might even say a disconnection from, the non-human world, understanding the role that dejection might play in ecological thinking has maybe never been more important. I will stop there. I think pretty much done on 45 minutes.
Certainly on 45 minutes, Joe, but not dead. Thanks very much, Joe, for that elaboration of an alternative ecopoetics that emphasizes disconnection, what you called a third space, I think, at one point, and also continual suspension, which is, I think, sounds quite painful. And I suppose that leads me to ask a question. Can you talk a little bit perhaps about dream, about the way for Coleridge dream and nightmare sometimes establishes a connection between him and the outside world that can be delightful or can actually be absolutely horrifying and overwhelming?
Are you thinking of Pains of Sleep?
Well, certainly one of the places, isn't it? Or I mean, Kubla Khan has a vision in a dream that's quite beatific.
Yeah, I mean, Coleridge's, I'm thinking of that moment where he's looking in the mirror in The Study in Keswick, and he's or Hartley's looking at the mirror and seeing the mountains turned upside down, and it helps Coleridge to think about the way that the mountains are kind of there and not there, and kind of a vision at the same time as they're real. It's not really a vision in a dream, but like a vision in reality, I suppose. And that makes them simultaneously kind of too real in that Sarah Coleridge phrase, and kind of monstrous. So there's something, as he finds in that Walk in the Lakes in 1799, where he worries that I think it's somewhere in the Scafell range that's going to overtake him. He does the same when he goes walking in 1802, that he worries about the way that the landscape is kind of overwhelming his body and his mind. That reality might, I guess, at any point seek into a dream when it comes to the natural world, that there's no, without a sense of, what am I trying to get at? That I think his dreams indicate the extent to which he's perpetually worried, both consciously and subconsciously, about where the limits of his self are, and particularly where the limits of the self and the natural world are. That's in poetry like Wordsworth, that's kind of comfortable, because that kind of seeking, that meshing is desirable, whereas in Coleridge it's that risk that the self might be completely kicked out of your own psyche, that's insanity, isn't it? Like, so there's yeah, I think it's I mean, I guess Greg can talk a little bit more at length about this as well, but it's